Before the first light of dawn, the village lay wrapped in silence, pierced only by the faint rustle of dried leaves, stirred by a cold, whispering wind. The sky was still heavy with darkness, dotted with fading stars that clung stubbornly to their places, as if unwilling to surrender to the day ahead. In this fragile hour, Ishan opened his eyes on the hard, uneven floor of a mud and thatch hut. There was no bed, no warmth, only the cold embrace of the earth, pressed against his thin, brittle frame. His body was small and frail, his hands calloused from work, already begun before he could even remember learning what it meant to live without fear. His feet were bare, worn by gravel thorns, and the jagged stones that lined the village paths, and the skin on his palms was broken and chapped. Yet he moved with a strange, steady purpose. Ishan's mornings were never leisurely. They began with a routine as unforgiving as the poverty he was born into. He would pull on the tattered shirt that barely covered his ribs, shake off the thin blanket that smelled of smoke and dust, and step outside into the pre-dawn chill. The village was still asleep, except for the few stray dogs that wandered between the mud houses, their low growls echoing across the empty paths. Each step Ishan took across the uneven dirt roads pressed him further into a life he had never chosen but had always known, the life of the hungry, the unseen, the discarded. By the time the first birds dared to sing, Ishan had already set off toward the fields where the landlord's men labored, overseeing the crops with watchful, indifferent eyes. The fields were more than just land. They were a stage for daily survival, a place where sweat and blood mingled with dust in an unending ritual. Each step he took was heavy, his bare feet grinding into the soil, scraping against roots and stones, leaving behind tiny imprints that would be forgotten by morning. He carried tools, fetched water, cleaned the plows, and bent under the sun and the sun's judgment. Always careful, always silent. Hunger was his constant companion, gnawing at his stomach in a rhythm that had become natural to him. From sunrise to sunset, Ishan worked for a piece of stale bread, often dry and crumbly, lacking even a hint of salt. He learned early the art of gratitude and patience. Every bite was to be chewed slowly, as though it were treasure, because to waste even a morsel was unthinkable. Hunger, he understood, was not merely physical. It was a teacher, an unyielding instructor, shaping his endurance, testing his spirit. The villagers referred to him simply as the poor boy. No one knew or cared to know his full name. In the eyes of those who had never experienced want, he was merely a shadow, a shape to be ignored. People looked away as he passed. Children would run by, kicking up dust at his feet, laughing at what they considered his misfortune. The wealthy villagers, clothed in clean, starched garments, merely waved him toward the fields. Their commands unspoken but clear: labor, endure, disappear. Ishan did not protest. He had learned long ago that questions served no purpose. The world had no use for the voices of the impoverished. To speak was to invite dismissal, and he had no time for empty words. Afternoons were a crucible. The sun bore down relentlessly, beating against his thin frame. Sweat ran in rivulets, mixing with the dust, drying on his skin, leaving it streaked and cracked. His hands blistered from the constant toil, his knees scraped raw from kneeling in the soil. But he persisted, because persistence was the only shield against starvation. Every day was a ritual of endurance, each hour a test of survival. Hunger gnawed at him, but he bore it like a silent oath, a quiet rebellion against the world that had given him nothing but want. And always, in the back of his mind, he carried his mother. Her face appeared in the dim recesses of his memory, the tired but kind smile, the thin hands that had held his so gently, yet with a strength born of necessity. He remembered the nights when she would eat only scraps to feed him, offering him the warmth and sustenance she denied herself. "Life will try to break you, Ishan," she had whispered in her final days. "But you must never let it." Those words became a mantra he recited silently to himself each night, lying on the cold earth, staring at the stars that seemed impossibly distant. Even the small comforts of home were cruel reminders of his deprivation. The hut offered scant protection from rain. When storms came, water would seep through the cracks in the roof, drenching the floor and the thin layer of straw that served as bedding. In the heat, the mud walls absorbed the sun, radiating heat back at night. There was no food to ease the discomfort, no relief from the constant ache of an empty stomach. And yet Ishan survived. He adapted. Survival itself became a form of art, practiced in silence and patience. One afternoon, a young boy, the son of a wealthy landlord, came to the fields. He observed Ishan silently for a moment, and then laughed, a cruel, sharp sound that cut through the air. "Look, the poor boy again, hugging the earth as if it were his only friend," he sneered. Ishan did not respond. He had learned the futility of words, the uselessness of explanation. Let the boy laugh, let the world mock him. It changed nothing. His labor continued, the rhythm of sweat and toil marking time, like the pulse of a life lived only to survive. The hours dragged on. The sun climbed high, unrelenting, and the earth beneath his feet grew hotter, the dust finer, clinging to his sweaty skin. Each movement brought new aches, new pains, but also a growing resilience. Every scrape, every blister, every pang of hunger was a lesson, a small victory over the forces that sought to keep him small and invisible. Ishan had become attuned to suffering. He had learned to read it, to anticipate it, and most importantly, to endure it without complaint. As the day waned and the landlord's men left, Ishan gathered the tiny portion of bread that was his reward. He held it in his calloused hands, inspecting it as if it were gold, and then ate slowly, savoring every crumb. Hunger had taught him appreciation, and deprivation had honed his patience. Sitting alone in the fading light, he often repeated a silent promise to himself. "One day I will not be this invisible. One day hunger will not decide my worth." Night fell, and Ishan returned to his mud hut. The darkness settled around him, heavy and oppressive. He lay down on the cold floor, listening to the wind through the cracks, the distant calls of animals, the faint murmurs of other lives around him. He thought of his mother, her voice, her hands, her lessons. He thought of the endless days of toil and hunger, and he thought of the stars above, so far, so bright, yet seemingly indifferent to the suffering below. But even under the weight of exhaustion, cold, and hunger, Ishan clung to a fragile spark, the desire to endure, to survive, to rise above the circumstances that had shaped him from birth. In that quiet moment before sleep took him, he whispered to himself, as he had countless nights before, "Tomorrow I will rise again. Tomorrow I will survive. And one day I will live." And so ended another day in the life of Ishan, the boy of hunger, toil, and silence, a life defined by poverty, but also by endurance, resilience, and the faint, unwavering hope of something more. The days that followed Ishan's childhood were never easy, but none had been as cruel as the winter of his 12th year. The chill had settled deep into the village, crawling into the cracks of mud walls and slipping through even the thickest of garments. For Ishan, warmth was a memory, distant and fleeting, like the scent of fresh bread or the soft laughter of children playing in the sun. But the cold was not his greatest enemy. His mother's illness had crept into their small hut silently, a shadow that had grown heavier with each passing day. She had been his anchor, the sole presence that had made poverty tolerable. Her hands, once strong and nimble, had grown frail. The skin that had once caressed his hair now trembled with each movement. Her breath came in shallow, uneven gasps, the sound of life teetering on a fragile edge. She would sit by the small hearth, staring into the dying embers, her eyes distant yet searching, as if trying to memorize every detail of her son's face before the darkness claimed her entirely. Ishan watched her, torn between fear and helplessness. The boy had already endured hunger, toil, and neglect. Yet this impending loss was a pain unfamiliar, raw, and suffocating. He would bring her water, warm it over the flickering fire, and offer it to her trembling hands. She would smile faintly, a ghost of the warmth she once radiated, and whisper words that made his heart ache with both pride and sorrow. "Do not cry, my son. Life will demand more of you than you know, but you must be strong. You must endure. You must never break, no matter what the world tries to do to you." The illness was merciless. It crept through her body, weakening her day by day, until even the simplest of movements exhausted her. She could no longer cook nor clean, nor tend the small garden that had once fed them. Ishan, though barely more than a boy, became her caretaker, her nurse, and, in many ways, her strength. He learned to lift her frail body, to coax her into drinking and eating, to whisper comforts she could no longer manage on her own. Yet every night, as the hut grew colder and the wind moaned through the cracks, Ishan would lie awake, listening to her shallow breathing, the quiet coughs that rattled her chest, and the faint, fragile sighs of someone clinging desperately to life. He would watch the shadows stretch across the walls, imagining the darkness as a slowly advancing tide, ready to claim the one person who had made his existence bearable. The villagers noticed the change in him. Where before he had been a silent worker, they now saw a boy who carried the weight of grief in his eyes, whose shoulders had grown hunched not from labor alone, but from the burden of care. Yet no one offered help, and Ishan did not ask. He had learned early that the world had little patience for those who begged for mercy, and fewer still for a boy who had nothing to give. As the weeks dragged on, her condition worsened. Nights became long, filled with agonizing stretches of silence broken only by her soft murmurs. Ishan would sit beside her, holding her cold hands in his own, whispering stories of a world beyond their village, a world where hunger and toil were not constants, where warmth and kindness were not rare treasures. He promised her over and over that he would survive, that he would rise above the life that had been forced upon him. One night, the winter wind howled louder than ever, rattling the thin walls and sending a chill deep into their bones. His mother, pale and fragile, turned her face toward him. Her eyes, once bright and full of life, were dim, but glimmered with a faint, unwavering strength. She smiled faintly, a motion almost imperceptible, and spoke in a voice so soft it was barely audible over the wind. "My son, you are all I have, all I can leave behind. Remember to live, not for me, not for the world, but for yourself. Never bow, never let them break you." Ishan clutched her hand tighter, feeling the life slipping from it like water through his fingers. His throat burned with unshed tears, but he remained silent. No words could give her back life, and any plea for mercy would have been empty. He could only sit, holding on to the last warmth she offered, and pray silently that she would not fade completely before morning. The night stretched endlessly. Ishan's mother spoke little after that, her words reduced to fragments, whispers and faint breaths. Ishan, in turn, refused sleep, afraid that closing his eyes for even a moment would mean missing the final threads of her life. He recalled the stories she had told him in his earliest days, tales of resilience, courage and quiet strength. Each memory, each lesson, now carried a weight he had never fully understood until the imminence of loss pressed down upon him. Finally, in the early hours before dawn, the inevitable came. Her breathing slowed, each exhale weaker than the last, until the final, shallow breath escaped, leaving behind an empty silence that seemed to reverberate in every corner of the tiny hut. Ishan remained by her side, unable to cry, unable to move, only gripping her hand and letting the reality settle around him like a suffocating shroud. She was gone. The last light in his life had been extinguished, leaving him with a world colder and emptier than before. For hours he sat there, unmoving, staring at the floor, listening to the distant calls of the village, waking to another day. He thought of all the mornings they had spent together, the warmth of her touch, the comfort of her voice. He realized with a crushing clarity that he had been unprepared for this absence, that no amount of work, no amount of endurance could have taught him to withstand such a loss. Yet even in the depths of despair, a spark remained. The lessons she had imparted, the resilience, the courage, the refusal to bow, had not left him. With a trembling hand, he touched the small bundle of cloth that had been her last gift to him, a scarf, worn and frayed, but filled with the essence of her presence. And in that silent moment, Ishan made a vow to himself, one that would define the course of his life. I will endure. I will survive. I will rise, not for her memory alone, but because she believed in me when no one else did. I will not break, no matter how cruel the world becomes. The winter dragged on. Ishan remained in the hut, tending to the small tasks that now fell entirely on his shoulders. The garden she had once nurtured wilted without care. The fire in the hearth dimmed without fuel. And yet Ishan persevered. Every chore, every task became a testament to her life, a way to honor the sacrifices she had made. He worked in silence, speaking only to the wind, the animals, and the memory of the woman who had given him the strength to endure. The villagers continued to see him as the poor boy, the orphaned son of a deceased mother, invisible and insignificant. But Ishan had changed. The grief, the helplessness, and the pain had forged in him a determination sharper than any blade. He carried his mother's lessons like armor, each act of survival, each breath of endurance, strengthening the resolve that one day he would no longer be bound by hunger, poverty, or neglect. And so, with the cold still pressing against the thin walls of his home, Ishan rose each morning, laboring, surviving, and remembering the touch of his mother's hands, the echo of her words, the love she had given without expectation. Her death was a wound that would never fully heal. Yet from it a fire had been lit, a fire that would propel him through the trials and horrors yet to come, shaping him into a man who would face the cruelty of the world with the strength and resilience she had instilled in him. In the long, silent nights, as Ishan lay upon the hard floor, staring at the faintly glowing stars, he whispered a final promise. I will survive, and I will not let the world break me. Your voice will guide me, Mother. I will endure for both of us. And in that bitter cold winter, the boy who had known hunger, toil, and loss learned a lesson, far more painful and far more enduring than any hardship before, that the loss of a single soul, no matter how cherished, could either destroy him or ignite the fire that would carry him through the darkness ahead. After his mother's death, the village no longer felt like a place of memory. It felt like a grave that breathed. Every corner reminded Ishan of what he had lost. The hearth where she once cooked, the doorway where she waited for him at dusk, the cracked wall against which she used to lean when her strength failed. The silence inside the hut was unbearable. Poverty had always lived with them, but now loneliness ruled absolutely. At 13, Ishan made a decision no child should ever have to make. He would leave. The town lay several miles away, beyond fields and dust roads that cut through barren land. People spoke of it as a place of opportunity, but also as a beast, one that rewarded the strong and devoured the weak. Ishan packed nothing but his mother's worn scarf and a small piece of bread hard as stone. He stepped onto the road barefoot, carrying grief on his back like an invisible burden. The journey was long and cruel. The sun burned his skin by day, and cold winds gnawed at him by night. Hunger followed him like a shadow, growing sharper with each mile. When his bread was gone, he drank from streams and chewed leaves to quiet the ache in his stomach. Several times he considered turning back, but back led only to emptiness. Forward at least held uncertainty. When Ishan reached the town, it was nothing like he had imagined. The streets were crowded, loud and merciless. Carts rattled past, vendors shouted, animals screamed, and people moved with urgency, their eyes fixed on survival. No one looked at him, not because he was invisible, but because they had learned that seeing suffering slowed them down. The town was full of people like him, thin men with hollow eyes, women carrying exhaustion in their bones, children already aged by hunger. Ishan searched for work. At the docks, he was pushed aside. At the markets, he was laughed at. At workshops, he was ignored. You're too small. You're too weak. Come back when you have skill. Skill, Ishan learned quickly, was a luxury. Hunger did not wait for training. Days passed. He slept under staircases, beside trash heaps, or in alleys where rats moved more freely than men. Each night, he wrapped his mother's scarf around his shoulders, breathing in the faint scent of smoke and memory. It was the only warmth he had left. Hunger in the town was different from hunger in the village. In the village, hunger was slow and familiar. In the town, it was sharp, aggressive, humiliating. Food was everywhere, visible, unreachable. He watched people eat roasted meat, fresh bread, warm meals. The smells tortured him. His stomach cramped so violently, some nights, that he thought it would tear itself apart. Once, driven beyond dignity, Ishan picked up a piece of bread from the ground outside a shop. It was dirty, trampled, barely recognizable as food. As he lifted it to his mouth, a shopkeeper struck his hand with a stick. "Get away, filth!" the man shouted. The bread fell back into the dirt. Ishan did not argue. He simply bowed his head and walked away, his hands shaking, not from pain but from shame. That night, he vomited bile and cried silently until his chest ached. Eventually, someone hired him. An old warehouse owner allowed Ishan to sweep floors and carry sacks. The pay was barely enough to survive, scraps of food, and a place to sleep near the door. The work was brutal. His back ached constantly, his fingers split and bled, but he endured. Endurance had become his only skill, yet even there cruelty followed him. Other workers mocked him, calling him orphan, rat, ghost. When something went missing, eyes turned toward him. Poverty, he learned, was always suspicious. Trust was reserved for those who could afford it. One night, a sack of grain was found torn open. No one knew how it happened, but blame did not require proof. Ishan was beaten. Not enough to kill him, just enough to remind him of his place. As he lay curled on the cold floor, bruised and shaking, he realized something that would shape him forever. The world did not hate him. It simply did not care whether he lived or died. And that indifference was far more dangerous than hatred. Weeks turned into months. Ishan grew leaner, harder. Hunger no longer frightened him. It sharpened him. He observed everything, how traders spoke, how prices were set, how lies were told with smiles. He listened. He learned, quietly. One evening, as he rested behind the warehouse, an old man sat beside him. The man had missing fingers and eyes that had seen too much. "Don't let this place eat you," the man said. Ishan looked at him confused. "It eats the weak," the man continued, "but it also fears those who learn." That night, Ishan did not sleep. For the first time since his mother's death, something stirred inside him, not hope but awareness. Survival was not enough. Endurance was not enough. To live, he would need to understand the world that crushed him. The town had tried to devour him. It had failed. And though Ishan did not yet know how, he understood one thing with terrifying clarity. If he did not grow sharper than the world would finish what hunger had started. As dawn broke over the rooftops, Ishan rose once more, bruised, starving, but alive, and for the first time quietly dangerous. By the time Ishan turned 15, the town had learned his shape, but not his name. He was known as the quiet boy, the one who swept floors, carried sacks, and never spoke unless spoken to. Silence had become his armor. Words he had learned were dangerous. They could be twisted, ignored, or used against you. So he worked, watched, and endured. The warehouse where he labored sat near the edge of the market district, its walls blackened by age and soot. Inside, grain sacks were stacked like small hills, guarded by locks that were strong but careless in the hands of men who trusted wealth more than truth. Ishan slept near the back entrance, curled on a mat so thin it barely separated his bones from the stone floor. It was not comfort, but it was shelter. One evening, as the town prepared for a festival, the warehouse buzzed with activity. Merchants came and went. Money changed hands. Laughter echoed where hunger usually lived. Ishan moved through the chaos like a shadow, sweeping spilled grain, lifting crates, keeping his head low. That night something went missing. A small chest of silver coins, earnings, meant for trade, vanished from the locked office. When the discovery was made the following morning, panic spread quickly. Voices rose. Accusations filled the air before facts had time to breathe. The owner's eyes scanned the workers. They stopped on Ishan. No one said his name. No one needed to. "He sleeps here," someone muttered. "He has nothing," another said. "He was here all night." That was enough. Ishan stood frozen as hands grabbed his arms. He tried to speak, to explain that he had not left his corner, that he had heard nothing, seen nothing, but his words fell into a room that had already decided. Truth, he learned in that moment, required status. Innocence required witnesses, and he had neither. They dragged him into the office, a small, windowless room that smelled of dust and old paper. The door slammed shut behind him. The air grew heavy. "Where did you hide it?" the owner demanded. "I didn't take anything," Ishan said quietly. The first slap came without warning. It was not meant to hurt. It was meant to silence. "Don't lie," another voice said. They searched him, found nothing. The absence of proof did not help him. It only angered them further. "If you didn't steal it," the owner said, leaning close, "then you know who did." "I don't," Ishan replied. That answer sealed his fate. They tied his wrists with rope rough enough to tear skin. They pushed him to the floor. The office, once a place of quiet order, became a chamber of judgment. The beating began slowly. A blow to the ribs, a kick to the back, a fist to the face. Each strike carried the same question: where is the money? Each answer was the same: silence or denial. Pain spread through Ishan's body like fire. His vision blurred. His mouth filled with blood. Yet something inside him refused to break, not out of courage, but out of emptiness. He had already lost everything worth losing. As hours passed, frustration turned into cruelty. They did not beat him because they wanted the truth. They beat him because they could. Poverty had placed him there. Power kept him down. At one point, someone held his head up by the hair and said, "You should be grateful. This is mercy." In other towns, thieves lose hands. "I am not a thief," Ishan whispered. The words earned him another blow. When night fell, they threw him into a storage room and locked the door. No food, no water, just darkness and the sound of his own breathing, ragged, uneven, painful. He lay on the floor, shaking, his body screaming, his mind drifting between memory and nightmare. He thought of his mother, of her voice telling him not to bow. He wondered if this humiliation, this pain, was what she had meant. Morning brought no relief. The owner returned, angrier now, fueled by rumors and fear. The silver had not reappeared. Someone had to pay. They took Ishan outside, where a small crowd had gathered. Workers, merchants, onlookers hungry for spectacle. No trial, no defense, no mercy. Someone shouted, "Make him confess." Another said, "He deserves it." Ishan stood barely upright, ropes cutting into his wrists. His body bruised and swollen. He looked at the faces around him, faces that had seen him work, suffer, starve. Not one spoke for him. The realization cut deeper than any blow. He was alone, completely. They beat him again. This time something changed. As pain tore through him, Ishan stopped pleading. He stopped explaining. He stopped hoping. Instead, he remembered. He remembered hunger. He remembered loss. He remembered silence. And in that silence, something hardened. When they finally stopped, it was not because they believed him, but because he no longer reacted. A broken man was no longer entertaining. They untied him and shoved him toward the street. "Leave," the owner said. "If we see you again, we won't stop." Ishan collapsed just beyond the market road, his body trembling, his vision dark. People stepped around him. No one helped. Hours later, as rain began to fall, he crawled beneath a broken cart and lay there, letting the cold wash over his wounds. He did not cry. He did not curse. He stared at the ground and understood something with terrifying clarity. The world did not need him to be guilty. It only needed him to be weak. And weakness, he swore silently, would not remain his only identity. That night, soaked, bleeding, and discarded, Ishan did not die. But something inside him did, and something far more dangerous took its place. The rain did not stop. It fell steadily, mercilessly, as if the sky itself had chosen to participate in Ishan's punishment. Water pooled beneath the broken cart where he lay, seeping into his clothes, mixing with blood and dirt, until his body felt less like flesh and more like soaked earth. Every breath burned. Every movement sent sharp pain through his ribs. Yet he remained alive, conscious enough to feel everything, weak enough to resist nothing. By morning, hands grabbed him again. Not gentle hands, not curious hands. These were hands trained to restrain, to drag, to control. The warehouse owner had not been finished. Fear had fermented overnight, turning into rage. The missing silver still haunted him, and in his mind, there was only one place where blame could live. They pulled Ishan upright. His legs buckled immediately. "Take him," someone said. No explanation, no resistance. They hauled him through the back alleys of the town, away from the market, away from witnesses. The path led to an old stone building abandoned by law, claimed by cruelty. It had once been a storage cellar. Now it served a darker purpose. The door creaked open, and the smell hit him immediately. Damp stone, old blood, and fear that had soaked into the walls long before he arrived. Inside, the light was dim. A single torch flickered, casting shadows that twisted like living things. The floor was cold. Chains hung from the walls, rusted but strong. They tied Ishan to a wooden post. The ropes were pulled tight, too tight. His shoulders screamed as his arms were stretched behind him. He tried to steady his breathing, but pain invaded every thought. Someone poured water over his head, not to clean him, to wake him. "Tell us," the owner said calmly, almost tired, "where the money is." "I don't know," Ishan whispered. The first strike landed on his back, a thick stick, heavy, deliberate. He gasped, his knees trembled. The second strike followed immediately. Then the third. Pain exploded across his body, blooming in waves that made the world tilt and blur. He bit his lip until he tasted blood, refusing to scream, not out of bravery, but because screaming felt like surrender. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time lost its meaning. They beat him. They stopped. They questioned. They beat him again. Each cycle stripped something away. They hit his ribs until breathing became agony. They struck his legs until standing was impossible. They slapped his face when his eyes closed too long. At one point, someone held his chin and forced his head up. "Look at yourself," the man sneered. "This is what thieves become." Ishan's vision swam. He barely recognized the reflection in the puddle at his feet. A boy, swollen, bruised, broken. "I'm not a thief," he said again. That sentence earned him the worst beating yet. Something cracked inside his chest. Not a bone, something deeper. A belief, perhaps. A childish hope that truth mattered. It did not. They were not trying to extract information anymore. They were trying to erase him. Between blows, Ishan drifted in and out of consciousness. Memories surfaced without warning. His mother's hands, the warmth of her voice, the way she used to hum while stirring thin soup. He clung to those fragments as anchors, afraid that if he let go, there would be nothing left to return to. At some point the pain dulled, not because it lessened, but because his body could no longer react properly. His head dropped forward, his breathing slowed. Blood dripped from his lip onto the stone floor. "He's fading," someone said. "Good," another replied. "Let him think about it." They left him there, alone, tied, broken. The torch burned low. Darkness crept closer. The cellar became unbearably quiet, broken only by the sound of water dripping somewhere in the distance, and Ishan's shallow breaths. This was the breaking point, not because of pain, but because of understanding. Hanging there, barely alive, Ishan realized something with devastating clarity. No one was coming to save him. Not the town, not justice, not fate. If he survived, it would be because he refused to die. In that silence, something inside him changed shape. The fear that had once lived in his chest hardened into resolve. The tears he had never shed dried into something colder, sharper. He stopped thinking like a child who wanted fairness and began thinking like someone who understood power. When footsteps returned, they found him still alive. Barely. The owner stood before him, eyes searching for something. Remorse, confession, collapse. "Last chance," the man said. "Confess." Ishan lifted his head with effort that bordered on impossible. "I have nothing to give you," he said. "Not even my fear." The response enraged them. The final beating was swift and merciless. When they were done, they cut the ropes. Ishan collapsed to the floor like discarded cloth. They dragged him outside and threw him onto the muddy ground behind the building. "Get him out of town," someone said. "If he dies, let it be somewhere else." They left him there. The sky was grey. The rain had stopped. Ishan lay unmoving, staring at nothing, his body barely responsive. For a long time he did not move. Then slowly, his fingers curled. Pain flared, reminding him he was still alive. And with that pain came a final, quiet promise, formed not in anger, but in certainty. Never again would he be powerless. Never again would silence protect his oppressors. Never again would he trust mercy from those who thrived on cruelty. If the world demanded monsters to survive, then he would become something it could not crush. As the wind passed over his broken body, Ishan closed his eyes, not to surrender, but to endure. The boy who had entered that cellar would never return by the time the 6th winter arrived. The man no longer counted days. Time had become something soft and useless, like ash slipping through fingers. Morning and night were no longer opposites. They were simply different shades of exhaustion. The body learned to wake before pain arrived. The way animals sense storms before the sky changes color. He would open his eyes slowly, testing the world with caution, as if sight itself could hurt. The room had not changed. 4 walls, a ceiling stained with old leaks, a floor that remembered every fall. But something inside him had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to make the air feel unfamiliar. He noticed it the first time silence stopped frightening him. In the earlier days, silence had been worse than shouting. Silence meant waiting. Silence meant the mind had space to replay everything it wished to forget. Silence meant memories came back uninvited, dressed as ghosts. But now silence sat beside him like a tired companion. It did not speak. It did not accuse. It simply existed. He leaned against the wall, knees pulled close, arms loose around them. His body was thinner now, shaped by hunger and endurance rather than youth. Bones spoke louder than flesh. Every movement carried a dull ache, but the ache no longer surprised him. Pain had become part of the language of living. What surprised him was a thought, not a memory. Not fear, a thought. I'm still here. It was not pride. It was not hope. It was observation, calm and strange, like noticing a candle still, burning in a room long after the wind was expected to kill it. He closed his eyes and followed the thought gently, the way one follows a wounded animal without wanting to scare it away. Still here meant something had failed. Everything designed to erase him had not succeeded. The hunger, the beatings, the isolation. The words meant to shrink him into nothing. They had damaged him, yes. They had carved into his body and rearranged his soul. But they had not completed their task. He exhaled slowly, feeling the breath scrape his chest on the way out. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the scars and the silence, something remained unbroken, not strong, not heroic, just stubborn, quietly present, refusing to disappear. The realization did not make him smile. It made his throat tighten, because surviving was not the same as living. He had survived long enough to understand the cost. He remembered the person he used to be, but that memory no longer hurt the way it once did. It felt distant, like remembering someone else's childhood home, familiar but unreachable. That boy had believed the world made sense if you were good enough, if you worked hard enough, if you obeyed the rules. That belief had died early. In its place was something rougher, heavier, more honest. The world did not reward goodness. It tested endurance. A sound broke the quiet, footsteps in the distance. Not close enough to signal danger, not far enough to ignore. He didn't tense. He didn't prepare. He simply listened, letting the sound pass through him like weather. This was new. Earlier, every sound had been a threat. Every movement outside the door had turned his body into a knot of panic. But now fear had lost its sharpest edge. It still existed, but it no longer controlled the shape of his thoughts. Fear, he realized, was loud only when it believed it had power. He shifted slightly, adjusting his position. The movement sent a small wave of pain through his leg, but he breathed through it. Pain no longer demanded reaction. It asked only to be acknowledged. He wondered when that change had happened. There had been no single moment of transformation, no dramatic decision, no vow whispered into darkness. Change had arrived the way erosion does, slow, patient, invisible, until the shape of things was different. He had reached a point beyond despair. Despair still hoped for an end. He had reached acceptance of continuation, and in that acceptance, something unexpected had grown. Clarity. He understood now that waiting for mercy was useless. Mercy was rare, accidental, and unreliable. If anything were to change, it would not arrive from outside. It would have to begin inside him, quietly, invisibly, the way roots begin underground before breaking stone. He thought about choice. For a long time, he believed he had none. Every decision had been taken from him, every direction dictated by force. But even in confinement, even in suffering, choice existed in smaller forms. Choice of memory, a choice of meaning, choice of what pain would define him and what pain would not. He could not choose his situation, but he could choose what it would turn him into. That thought frightened him more than helplessness ever had, because it placed responsibility back into his hands. If he became nothing, he could no longer blame only the world. He sat with that discomfort, letting it settle. Growth, he realized, did not feel like hope. It felt like weight, like being asked to carry something. Heavy because you were the only one left who could. The footsteps returned, closer this time. A shadow passed beneath the door. Voices murmured, indistinct, unimportant. He remained still, eyes open, breath steady. Whoever they were, whatever they wanted, they no longer owned his entire inner world. That space, small but intact, belonged to him. When the sounds faded, he did something he had not done in a long time. He imagined a future, not a fantasy of freedom, not revenge, not justice, just continuity. A version of himself still walking, still breathing, still observing. A man shaped by suffering but not defined solely by it. Someone who remembered what had been taken, but also what had been preserved. The image was faint, fragile, but it existed. And existence, he had learned, was a powerful thing. He rested his head against the wall and closed his eyes, not to escape, but to gather himself. The darkness behind his eyelids felt different now, less like a prison, more like a waiting room. Whatever came next, more pain, more loss, more endurance, he would meet it with open eyes. Not because he was fearless, but because he had reached the place where fear no longer decided who he was. Scene 6 ended not with freedom, not with victory, but with something quieter and more dangerous to those who wished him erased. A man who understood himself. The seventh phase of his life did not begin with action. It began with restraint. He learned that power did not always announce itself through movement. Sometimes the most dangerous change was invisible, like a current beneath still water. From the outside, nothing about him appeared different. He ate when food came. He stood when ordered. He spoke only when required. His body remained obedient, his eyes lowered, his posture neutral. But inside, something had sharpened. Awareness had become habit. He noticed patterns now, small, repetitive details others overlooked. The timing of footsteps, the way certain voices changed pitch when they lied, the pauses before commands, the hesitation before cruelty. He learned which silences meant danger and which were simply empty. Earlier, he had lived moment to moment, reacting. Now, he observed, observation created distance. Distance created control, not over his circumstances, but over himself. There was a particular moment that marked the shift clearly, though no one else would have noticed it. A man near him collapsed one evening. It happened quietly. No dramatic fall, no sound loud enough to draw attention. Just a slow, tired surrender of the body. Knees bending, hands reaching for nothing. Breath stopping in a way that felt more like forgetting than dying. People froze. Fear spreads faster than compassion in places like this. To help is to be seen. To be seen is to be chosen next. He felt the old instinct rise inside him, the one that said do nothing. The instinct that had kept him alive by keeping him invisible. But another voice followed it now, calmer, heavier. If I do nothing, I choose what this place is making of me. The conflict was brief, but it was real. He moved, not dramatically, not heroically, just enough. He knelt beside the fallen man and placed 2 fingers against his neck. No pulse. He closed the man's eyes, not as an act of kindness, but of recognition. This was a person, not an object that had malfunctioned. He did not call out. He did not protest. He did not demand attention. When others arrived, he stepped back into position, face blank, hands still. Later, as he sat alone, the weight of that small action settled on him. He had crossed a line, not a line of rules, but a line of identity. He had chosen to acknowledge another human being in a place designed to erase humanity. That choice terrified him more than pain ever had, because it proved something he could no longer deny. He still cared. Caring was dangerous. Caring created attachment. Attachment created vulnerability. Vulnerability was punished here, efficiently and without apology. Yet the caring did not leave. It stayed with him, quiet but persistent, like a question without an answer. He thought about resistance, not the loud kind sung about in stories, but the kind that survived in reality. Resistance that looked like patience, like memory, like refusing to forget names, even when names were never spoken aloud. He began to collect moments, not objects, those could be taken, but moments. A shared glance that acknowledged suffering, a silent nod that said, "I see you," the refusal to laugh at cruelty. Small things, fragile things, but they formed a shape. At night, when sleep came in fragments, he reflected on the strange truth that had emerged. The system around him depended on predictability, on broken people behaving in broken ways. Despair was useful. Chaos was manageable. What it could not tolerate was quiet clarity, a person who understood the rules without believing in them. That kind of person was dangerous. He did not yet know what he would do with that danger. He only knew he would not waste it. There were days when doubt returned, heavy and convincing. Days when exhaustion whispered that this inner shift meant nothing, that the world would crush him regardless of what he felt or believed. On those days, he reminded himself of something simple. They had tried to turn him into less, and failed. Failure leaves evidence. The evidence was his continued ability to choose, even if those choices were small, even if they changed nothing immediately. One night he heard someone crying quietly nearby, not loudly enough to be punished, not softly enough to be ignored. The sound cut through the dark with uncomfortable honesty. He did not move toward the sound. Instead, he whispered, not words, just a presence. A sound that said you are not alone without promising rescue. The crying slowed, then stopped. He lay awake long after, staring into the darkness, understanding for the first time that strength was not about overpowering others. It was about refusing to surrender one's inner shape. By the end of Scene 7, he was no longer merely enduring. He was preparing, not for escape, not for revenge, but for the moment when endurance would no longer be enough. And that moment, though unseen, was approaching. Power, he learned, did not always come from strength. Sometimes it came from patience shared between people who had nothing else left. The 8th stage of his transformation began when he stopped seeing others as background. For a long time, survival had demanded isolation. Every person nearby was a risk, someone who might break under pressure, someone who might betray without intending to, someone whose weakness could become contagious. Distance had been safety, but now distance felt incomplete. He began to notice how suffering synchronized people without their permission. Hunger followed the same rhythm in every body. Exhaustion erased differences. Pain created a common language that needed no translation. They were already connected. They just did not know it yet. He did not seek followers. He did not speak of plans. He did not even trust his own thoughts enough to give them shape. Instead, he practiced something more subtle, listening. When people spoke, rarely cautiously, he listened without judgment. He remembered details others forgot. Who limped on the left side? Who avoided eye contact? Who had once been something else? A teacher, a laborer, a father, a son. Memory became his quiet rebellion. Remembering was an act of resistance in a place built on forgetting. Trust did not arrive suddenly. It crept in through repetition, through consistency, through the realization that he did not disappear when fear rose, nor did he take advantage when weakness showed itself. One man began sitting near him at night. They did not speak at first. Shared silence was safer than shared words. Over time, silence itself became communication. Another joined, then another. They did not form a group. They formed a pattern. Each one sensed it, but avoided naming it. Naming things gave them weight, and weight attracted attention. He understood the danger. Any structure could be destroyed. Any leader could be removed. The system was skilled at breaking visible threats, so he avoided visibility. He encouraged no loyalty to himself, only awareness of one another. The idea was simple and therefore dangerous. Pay attention. Pay attention to who disappeared. Pay attention to how punishment moved. Pay attention to moments when control weakened. Attention sharpened instinct. Instinct, when shared, became coordination. One evening, a routine inspection did not happen. It was a small thing, easy to miss. But they noticed. He saw it in the way heads lifted slightly, in the way eyes searched the space, not with hope, but with calculation. A delay like that meant something elsewhere had demanded attention. Distraction created opportunity. No one acted. That was the lesson. Acting too early was worse than not acting at all. Later, when the inspection finally came, harsher than usual, they understood the cost of awareness. Knowledge increased risk. Knowing what was possible made endurance heavier. Some people pulled back. Fear reclaimed them. He did not judge them. Fear was not failure. Fear was information. Those who remained did not speak about courage or purpose. They spoke about small logistics, where to stand, when to move, how to avoid drawing notice. They were not planning rebellion. They were preparing for unpredictability, and preparation, he realized, was the first real shift in power dynamics. One night, someone asked him a question. Not directly. Nothing so obvious. The man said, "Do you think this place ever makes mistakes?" The question hung between them, heavy with implication. He considered his answer carefully. "Yes," he said quietly. "But only when people expect perfection." The man nodded. That was enough. From that moment, something changed. Not dramatically, not visibly, but structurally. People began to act as if the system could be read, not just endured, as if its patterns could be learned. Hope did not enter the space. Something colder did. Confidence. Not confidence in success, but confidence in understanding. He felt the responsibility grow heavier with each passing day. Leadership, even unspoken, attracted consequence. If harm came, it would not fall randomly. He accepted that. Responsibility was not a reward. It was a burden taken voluntarily. At night, he questioned himself, wondered if he was leading others toward survival or toward destruction. The line was thin and invisible until crossed. But retreat was no longer possible. Once people realize they are not alone in their awareness, ignorance can never be reclaimed. By the end of Scene 8, the space around him felt different. Not freer, not safer, but awake. And awakening, he knew, was irreversible. Every structure eventually reveals its weakness, not through force, but through routine. The 9th phase began the day routine failed twice. The first failure was small, almost meaningless on its own. A miscount, a number spoken aloud, then corrected. No punishment followed, no explanation given. The moment passed, unnoticed by most, but not by those who had learned to pay attention. The second failure came hours later. A door that should have remained locked did not. It was open only slightly, barely enough to be seen as intentional, just enough to suggest that someone, somewhere, had made an assumption and been wrong. No one moved. Not immediately. Movement without certainty was suicide. They had learned that lesson early. He watched faces instead of the door, watched the subtle changes, tightened jaws, widened pupils, breathing that slowed in deliberate control. Fear was present, but it had transformed. It was no longer panic. It was calculation. The system depended on the belief that no one would dare. Belief was its strongest wall. He felt the weight of decision press against him. Not spoken, not assigned, simply assumed. Awareness had made him visible in a way that obedience never had. He did not want this moment. Leadership always arrived disguised as inevitability. He looked again at the door. Opportunity was never clean. It never announced itself with certainty. It arrived incomplete, demanding interpretation. Someone whispered his name, not loudly, not directly. A sound shaped like a question. He did not answer. Instead, he stepped forward, not toward the door, but sideways. A repositioning. A signal without command. 2 others followed. The movement was subtle enough to be mistaken for coincidence. But coincidence repeated itself too many times became pattern. The door remained open. Seconds stretched. Then quietly, someone crossed the threshold. Not him, a younger man. Thin, nervous eyes, already carrying regret and resolve in equal measure. The kind of person who knew his own fear and moved anyway. The door closed behind him. Nothing happened. For several long moments the world held its breath. Then the sound came. Not a scream, not an alarm. A blunt impact, followed by silence. The message was clear. Mistakes were still punished. The body was returned later, left in a place where everyone would see it. Not as warning, but as reminder. The system was correcting itself. Guilt settled heavily in his chest, not because he had ordered anything, but because he had allowed possibility to exist, because awareness had created courage, and courage had met consequence. That night no one spoke. Silence returned, but it was different. Now heavier, sharper, it carried names. He replayed the moment endlessly. The repositioning, the pause, the choice not to act more decisively or not to stop what followed. Responsibility has a cruel shape. It does not wait for permission. He wondered if he had crossed from resistance into manipulation, if his restraint had been wisdom or cowardice disguised as patience. Sleep did not come. Before dawn, someone sat beside him. An older man, scarred, tired in a way that suggested long familiarity with loss. He chose, the man said quietly. Yes, he replied. And you didn't stop him? No, the older man nodded. Then don't insult him by pretending it was an accident. The words settled something inside him. Not comfort, but clarity. People were not pieces. They were participants, and participation carried risk. The system had revealed something important that day. Not its weakness, but its fear. Fear did not eliminate opportunity. It reshaped it. Control had tightened. Movement became more dangerous, but also more predictable. Pressure increased. Predictability followed. He began to understand the rhythm of retaliation, how punishment clustered, how attention focused, how resources shifted after disruption. The system reacted. Reaction exposed structure. The young man's death had not been meaningless, but meaning came at a price he would carry. By the end of scene 9, the space felt changed again. Not awake anymore, alert. And alertness was a double-edged thing. It sharpened intention, but also narrowed time. They were no longer waiting for opportunity. Opportunity was now waiting for them, and it would not wait long. The 10th moment did not announce itself. No alarms, no sudden violence, no grand declaration that history was about to bend. It arrived quietly, the way endings often do, disguised as another ordinary hour. The air felt heavier that morning. Not because of weather, but because attention had sharpened to a painful degree. Everyone sensed it, though no one named it. After what had happened, after the correction, the system had tightened its grip. Order had become rigid. Movement had narrowed. Pressure was everywhere. And pressure, he knew, always demanded release. He stood among the others, posture unchanged, expression neutral. The discipline of invisibility still mattered. But inside him, something had settled into a final shape. He was no longer asking if something would happen. He was asking how much damage could be survived. There is a moment in every long suffering when fear stops being the loudest voice, when calculation overtakes hope, when the question shifts from how do I get out to what can I afford to lose. He had reached that moment. He had not chosen it. It had chosen him. The system made another mistake that day. Not a visible one, a human one. Someone spoke out of turn. Not harshly, not cruelly, just carelessly. A sentence delivered without awareness of who was listening. Authority relaxed for half a second. Half a second was enough. He saw it in the way people adjusted their stance, in the subtle alignment of bodies that had learned to move without instruction. The collective awareness that had been growing now reached coherence. No one looked at him. That was the most important detail. Leadership had dissolved into alignment. That was safety. He felt a strange calm settle over him. Not courage, not confidence, acceptance. He understood now that survival had brought him here, not to escape, but to decide what survival meant going forward. Endurance alone was no longer sufficient. Endurance without direction became submission. The opportunity that followed was imperfect, incomplete, risk-filled, exactly the kind that reality offered. A shift in routine, a redistribution of attention. Resources moved elsewhere. The structure leaned just slightly. He did not signal. He acted. Not dramatically, not aggressively, decisively. He stepped where he should not have been able to step, took what should not have been accessible, spoke only when silence would have been interpreted as guilt. Others followed, not because he commanded them, but because the moment demanded coherence. What happened next was messy, not heroic. There were no clean victories. There was resistance, confusion, consequence, pain. But there was also something the system could not immediately erase. Momentum. For the first time, actions were not isolated. They overlapped. They supported one another unintentionally. The structure responded, but slower than before. Control lagged. That created space. In that space, something irreversible occurred. People saw themselves act. Once that happens, obedience never fully recovers. He felt the cost immediately. The weight of consequence pressed down hard and fast. He knew this moment would mark him permanently. Whether or not the outcome favored him, this was not escape. This was commitment. Later, much later, when the dust had settled into a new pattern of order, he sat alone again. Different place. Same stillness. His body ached. His future uncertain. But his mind was clear. He thought back to the first realization, I am still here. Now the thought had changed. I chose to be here. That distinction mattered. He did not know what would follow. Retaliation, transfer, erasure, survival in another form. But whatever came next would not be endured blindly. The system had shaped him, but not finished him. And whether history would remember him or not no longer mattered. Because he remembered himself. Scene 10 did not end the story. It ended waiting. Thanks for watching video, like and subscribe.